Hi, everyone. Um, Welcome. Glad you can join. I want to first recognize that these are challenging times for nearly everyone, and I want to acknowledge that and thank you for joining us. And hopefully this is kind of a respite from thinking about the pandemic that we're all dealing with in different ways. And I hope that you are all healthy and safe. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get going. The best way to answer or ask questions is in the chat box. And I will again remind people that it's best if you select all panelists and attendees when you send your message so that everyone can see them and not just the three panelists. So for clarifying questions as we go along, you're welcome to ask those and we'll try to get to them, but most questions and any broader discussion we're gonna have at the end of the slideshow. So if you have bigger questions, please save them. And then finally, I would just like to mention that there are some graphic images in here. A lot of wildlife advocates are used to that, but if you're not, please be prepared and we will try to note them out when they're upcoming so that you can choose to look away if you need to. And apologies if we forget to do that. And just before we really dig into it, I want to acknowledge that we are a big coalition. TrapFree New Mexico has a number of organizations and volunteers, and only a few of us are represented here today, but there are a lot of people doing really important work. Several of them are joining this webinar as attendees, so thank you for that. And it's important to note that we're broad and we're diverse and we're only getting bigger. And with that, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Chris Smith. I work for Wild Earth Guardians, which is a conservation advocacy organization based here in New Mexico, where we were founded 30 years ago. And we work to protect and restore the wildlife, wild places, wild rivers, and the health of the American West. I work as part of our wildlife team, and I was born here in New Mexico, and I'm happy to advocate for wildlife here in the southwestern part of the United States. And here are some ways on the screen that you can connect with us if you'd like to. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jessica Johnson from Animal Protection Voters.
Hey everyone, it's so great to be here with you all virtually. I know that we're all missing all of the opportunities that we normally have to gather in person, but I think this is pretty good too, and I'm really excited that we'll be able to share some information with you all about this issue so that you can go out into your communities, even if it's virtually as well, and share this information and get people engaged. So I'm Jessica Johnson. I'm the Chief Legislative Officer for Animal Protection Voters, and we are the legislative arm of Animal Protection of New Mexico, which was founded over 40 years ago now, and works to create systemic positive change for all animals in our great state. APNM has done years and years of work, including legislative advocacy, but in 2002, Animal Protection Voters was formed as a way for us to not only continue our legislative work, but do even more of it and also get involved in the political sphere. So we are focused on pushing animal-friendly legislation at all levels of government. We want to build an effective political voice for animals in our state, and we want to hold our legislators accountable for how they are voting and taking action on the issues that we care about. So there's lots of ways to get involved with us throughout the year. I'm in the state legislature in the Capitol building every year, basically every day of this session. So I hope to, I know that I've seen a lot of you there. I hope to see more of you there the next time we can all gather there. And then just got some information there about where to find us online. And you can't see her, but our third panelist, I'm going to kick it off to her, Mary Catherine Ray with Sierra Club.
Hey, thanks, Jessica, and thanks, everyone. Just a brief word about Sierra Club. I volunteer as wildlife chair for our Rio Grande chapter, which encompasses New Mexico and West Texas. And part of our mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. And trapping does somewhat interfere with the first two. So I'm going to go ahead and next slide, Chris, because I know you can't see me. I included a picture of me in the slideshow. I live in a really remote part of Socorro County where internet service is somewhat unreliable and rickety, which is why I'm having to join you all by phone. And sadly, it's also the land of traps. So I'm going to kick this off by talking about some of my experiences encountering traps. So this happened, go to the next slide. One of the most memorable, and not in a good way, I was leading a Sierra Club outing in February of 2011. And you can see from the photo that it was a gorgeous winter day. The air was cool, but we were not cold. I took this picture of some stragglers. We were waiting for them to catch up. And prior to this picture, we had already seen a golden eagle elk crossed our path just before this picture was taken. But sadly, shortly after this picture, something else happened. We continued to walk on. We dropped down into a canyon and we're walking on the shady side when I saw movement ahead, and I was getting excited that there might even be yet another wildlife sighting. But instead, go to the next slide, it was an utter horror that met our gaze. We found a coyote who was caught in a leg hold trap, and the movement that we saw was her running to try to get away, and when she reached the end of the chain, it jerked her so hard she almost was flipping over. And she was clearly, having done this over and over again, was making the injury to her foot even worse. And we could see there was bone protruding. It was just a horrible, horrible mess. The mood of the day changed completely. I mean, from our effervescent enjoyment and joyous hike that we were having, it utterly became dark and somber. I, at that point, did not know how to safely release an animal from a trap without being bitten or being hurt or hurting the animal. We were not in cell service, so there was no way to reach anybody to come for help. So the entire group agreed we were going to end the outing and make our way back to the vehicles, which we did, trying to reach help on a cell phone the entire way, and we're not successful. So I couldn't reach anybody until I got home, which was late in the afternoon, when I called the Department of Game and Fish and a game warden to tell him what we had seen, what we had found, and he agreed to meet me the following morning. After we hung up, I realized that I was probably gonna, when I took him to this place, to this coyote, have to be a witness to her euthanasia, probably by gunshot. I'd called, after I talked to the game warden that afternoon, I called some rehab places in New Mexico, just on the off chance that if we could get her out of the trap, we could take her for veterinary care, and no one would take a coyote. I even called down in Texas, in Anthony, and the person who talked to me on the phone said something I'll never forget. She said, it would probably be better with this injury for the coyote to die in the place that she lived than in some strange place. So it was with a really heavy heart that I met the game warden and we made our way to the location. But it was a huge relief to see that the coyote was gone. I don't think that the trapper had been there because the trap was sitting out on the ground. It had not been reset, and there were no other tracks besides the ones we made the day prior. So I think she managed to escape somehow, probably wringing off her own foot. The game warden would not allow me to go over to the trap and look closely. He said he didn't want any evidence being tampered with, inadvertently. So I wasn't able to see if her foot was still there. I don't really know. But I like to think that maybe she got away and maybe that awful injury could heal. because it's not unheard of that coyotes in the wild sometimes have 3 legs. So I will hope the best for her for that. But go to the next slide. One of the hardest things I've ever done was to walk away from that coyote and leave her in such horrible distress. I took many photos, and I made a promise that I would do everything I could to publicize her suffering and make sure people saw it, because there was nothing else that I could do. And as you can see, she did become the Blue Coyote logo for TrapFree New Mexico. So I don't know if you all know that, but when you see that logo in the future, I hope you'll remember her suffering and remember the work that we are not going to stop doing until we end this. And I wish I could tell you that that was the last time I had a run-in with a trap, but go to the next slide. Though they're not required, they're my 2 dogs, and this is a picture from hiking in summer when traps are not as likely in the national forest. And I always keep my dogs on leashes. Trappers like to say that all you need to do is put your dog on a leash and everything will be fine. But sadly, I learned to my dismay that's not actually true. Go to the next slide. There's my dog Greta, who is actually the same exact size as a coyote. She weighs 33 pounds. A lot of people are surprised to learn that coyotes are just so small, but that they really are a very small carnivore. Go to the next slide. About 7 years after the incident, and almost exactly 7 years after finding the trapped coyote, I was hiking solo in this canyon, which is just a few miles uphill from my home. And it is, of course, impossible to know where traps are hidden. There aren't any warning signs, and maybe I should have been thinking about it, but I wasn't. It was such a beautiful day. Traps were just not on my mind. And suddenly, Greta leapt into the air shortly after this picture was taken, making the most ungodly vocalization, screaming, wailing that I could imagine a dog making. And I looked in horror to see that she, my own dog, had been caught in a leg hold trap. She was screaming, biting frantically and constantly at the trap. And the only good thing is, since the coyote incident, I learned how to get an animal out of a trap. I luckily had a really lightweight hoodie that I used to cover, I did my best to cover her head to protect my hands from being bitten, to try to get her out of the trap. And unfortunately, it's not as easy as that sounds, because she was biting so constantly, I barely was able to do it. I did manage to protect my hands from puncture wounds, and I got her out in a fairly short amount of time. Go to the next slide. This is a picture of the trap location. The path I was on, you can see it in the picture. The trap, I took the picture after I got Greta out, so this is after it had been sprung by her and she was rescued. You can see where it was, and it was practically in the path. And this is not illegal, and the reason being that this particular path is not official in any way. It's just a game trail that runs up the middle of the canyon, and so there is no legal restriction. The restrictions apply only to trails that are recognized by an agency that are on a map, which of course this didn't apply. So in that respect, this trap was located perfectly legally. Next slide. I wanted to show you Greta after the incident. Again, she was in the trap for probably less than a minute, but you can clearly see which foot was in the trap. She had a laceration on the back of her foot, actually above her paw, on the back. It was probably about 1.5 inches long. She limped for a while. There wasn't anything broken that I could tell. And she did have swelling that lasted for about a week. I can only imagine that the coyote had a similar injury, and had Greta been in the trap for much longer, she could have had the same sort of catastrophic injury that the coyote developed. So I was really grateful to be able to get her out. Go to the next slide, and you'll see a picture of the trap. Most traps have something, either levers or springs or something on the sides that you have to push down on in order to get the trap jaws to release. And I was really grateful that I was strong enough to actually make this happen with this particular trap, because there are traps that are legal that I am not strong enough to open. And as I was frantically feeling for the levers with Greta screaming and biting, I was just hoping that I would be able to open it, and indeed that is what happened. Go to the next slide. I was incredibly angry that a trapper could do this to us, and when I got home, I again called a game warden. I told him where the trap was. I wanted retribution. I wanted the trapper to suffer some kind of penalty for having done this to us. But the trap had the required 3/16 of an inch gap where the jaws close. It's called an offset. And I mean, 3/16 of an inch, you can barely see daylight through. I don't know why trappers and the Department of Game and Fish think this makes everything better. The trap that caught the coyote also had this gap, and clearly it did not make everything better. I was hoping that maybe there would be no trapper ID. Trappers are required to mark their traps with either their name or with an identifying number issued by the Department of Game and Fish, and in the field, I had not seen it. So my hope was, yeah, get him for that. But it's there. There's a little copper ferrule attached to the trap swivel. You can see where I've placed the arrow. So in fact, the trapper did nothing illegal according to the state rules. Go to the next slide. Trappers have no liability. They don't have any responsibility to human or canine victims. For the harm done to us, there was absolutely no recourse. And there's no penalty for harm to non-target wildlife species. Obviously, my dog was a non-target species. The trapper didn't intend to catch my dog, but certainly did. We know that wildlife species that are not intended can include things from javelina, when we've documented this, javelina to black bears, to endangered species like Mexican wolves, all of which we have records of having been captured by traps, having been injured, and sometimes even being killed. In no case are trappers held to account. So thank you for listening to these incidents and for letting me bear witness to how awful it is. I wouldn't wish anyone having this happen to them. And I will tell you that I've never been back to the place where the coyote was. It took me about 8 months to go back to the place where Greta got trapped. It changes the way you look at the place you love, that you love to walk in. And I know a number of you listening have also had similar experiences. So I want to thank you for being part of the TrapFree New Mexico effort. And I'm going to turn it back over now to my colleagues who are going to talk about the state of trapping in our state of New Mexico and what we can do to stop the scourge. So back to you guys.
Thank you for sharing, Mary Catherine. I know that every time you do that, it's traumatic, but it's really important. So I just want to note that, you know, the incidents like the ones Mary Catherine has witnessed, unfortunately, those are the most public incidents, and those are the ones that create a lot of the stories. But those are a tiny, tiny fraction of the damage that trapping does to New Mexico. It's not just people and companion animals that lose. New Mexico as a whole loses in many, many ways, some of which I'm going to talk about. Our native wildlife populations are decimated by traps. Our ecosystems, which rely on wildlife and biodiversity, are harmed by trapping. And then our state's reputation, especially as a state that, you know, has a lot of beautiful, beautiful public lands where people love to recreate and where tourists come, our state's reputation is harmed as well. I think one of the biggest issues, I know for me personally and for a lot of people, is that trapping is really the decimation of wildlife. And there are no bag limits in New Mexico for trappers. So a trapper can buy a very, very cheap trapping license and kill as many fur bearers as he wants. And I use the word he there intentionally. There are some female trappers, but the vast majority are men. So, you know, trapping is dislike hunting in many, many ways, but I think for me, this is the most poignant way. It's barely regulated. You can go and kill as many animals as you want. And the state sanctions and even encourages the slaughter of wildlife for fun and private profit. So I know that there's a lot going on this slide, but I just want to kind of show you a picture of how and what types of animals are killed, how many and what types. So if you see at the top, these are some of the animals that have been killed since 2013. This is harvest data, is what New Mexico Department of Game and Fish calls it, collected from trappers. And as you can see, since 2013 going through 2019, over 43,000 animals were killed by private trappers in the state. And I want to note that that doesn't include 4 years of coyote data, which is not required to be collected. So I think it's fair to add another 20,000 to that number, just to show the toll that this takes. And these are some of the wildlife that are targeted for trapping. I'm not going to go through them all, but you see coyotes, ringtails, several species of fox, badgers, bobcats, beavers. It's a lot of our native wildlife, and a lot of these play really, really critical roles in our ecosystems, along with being cute and adorable. And wildlife is already being pushed to the brink. It's not as though wildlife has an easy go of it here in New Mexico in the 21st century. We are dealing with the effects of climate change. We're dealing with drought. There's severe habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, all of which, along with other factors, are being called, or are factors in what is being called the sixth mass extinction in history. And I could tell you about that, but I'm just going to share a few headlines just from the last few months. This is the New York Times saying that wildlife collapse from climate change is predicted to hit suddenly and sooner. This is the Arizona Daily Star. Border wall threatens sweeping variety of wildlife, federal officials say. So this is the Trump administration admitting that the border wall threatens species. And I want to note that that typo in variety is from the Arizona Daily Star, not me. And this is from The Guardian. And this has to do with the current pandemic, but destruction of wildlife and the climate crisis is hurting humanity. So as we continue to push certain species and biodiversity as a whole to a brink and into extinction, we and our ecosystems are going to bear the brunt of that harm. And just to articulate what that might look like in New Mexico, this is a restoration site that Wild Earth Guardians has been working on for a number of years, where we've exclosed cattle from the San Antonio Creek. And we enabled, by building beaver dam analogs, we enabled beavers to come and reclaim this area. And what this has done is drastically raise the water table, create wetland habitat for other species, mitigate flooding, et cetera, et cetera. And so beavers are just one of the amazing animals that are critical to making our ecosystems function. And especially in the desert where those ecosystems are so fragile, all of these native species play really, really important roles. And beavers, like many animals, are trapped without limit in most parts of the state. So you would think that our wildlife agency, the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, has a pretty good handle on what trappers are doing to wildlife populations and how those populations are faring, right? Well, I'm about to share a few slides from the Department of Game and Fish, which they recently used to maintain the status quo of 0 bag limits on furbearers. So this slide is statewide gray fox harvest over the years as reported by trappers. So there's already a flaw in the methodology. But New Mexico Department of Game and Fish officials say that as long as there's kind of a steady-ish harvest, the population's doing fine. And this is kind of a crass analogy, but I feed my cats cat food every morning. They get the same amount. They assume that there's infinite cat food, but further examination would reveal that that's not the case. So I think this is a really flawed way to estimate gray fox populations. Here's another slide that New Mexico Department of Game and Fish uses, where they say, they basically judge how hard it is to trap a bobcat. And if it's getting too hard, that probably means there's not enough bobcats. But if it's pretty easy to trap them, there's probably enough. So again, I think deeply flawed way of measuring bobcat populations. And then this is my favorite, which they trot out, which is trapper opinion on bobcat population trends. So they just asked trappers, do you think the bobcat population is doing okay? And the trappers say, yeah, seems good. And they move along with that data supporting the total abandonment of regulations on bobcats. So this is our New Mexico Game Commission. These people are citizens charged with managing our wildlife. And the two women on the top are the chair and the vice chair. And they know that trapping is a serious issue because there's news stories about it. There's incidents like the ones Mary Catherine has witnessed, and there's a ton of people who are outraged about it. But recently, the Game Commission rubber-stamped agency proposed changes in order to protect trapping from the legislation that TrapFree New Mexico is trying to pass. And the changes are paltry at best, and they show to me that the commission is not really taking public health, public safety, ecosystem health, or animal cruelty very seriously. And this is the suite of changes that they passed in January of 2020. So they actually expanded some trap seasons. They actually expanded the window for checking one's underwater traps, so you don't have to go out there as often as you would otherwise need to. They closed 0.5% of our New Mexico public lands to trapping. And 3 of the big areas they closed, we've actually never seen trapping incidents with companion animals. So they're kind of arbitrary, and I would say that they're intended to kind of assuage people living in Santa Fe and Albuquerque from raising a stink about this. And they very, very moderately increased some setbacks from trailheads, but they didn't actually go on to protect trails. So there were no bag limits proposed for furbearers, and again, the vast majority of New Mexico public lands remain open to traps, snares, and the carnage that they cause. And these totally inadequate rules didn't even pass unanimously. These 2 commissioners voted against the rule changes, saying that the rule places an undue burden on trappers and that trapping is one of the most regulated sports in America, and New Mexico has some of the most extreme regulations. And both of those statements make my blood boil, so I'm just gonna keep going. So we're still in this situation where trapping exists on public lands, and New Mexico policymakers like the Game Commission and lawmakers like our state legislatures, they are consistently valuing the hobby of fewer than 2,000 trappers over the safety of all New Mexicans and tourists who recreate on our public lands. They're valuing a superficial fashion trend over the rights of native wildlife to exist. They are favoring a small but vocal subset of ranchers and trappers over the nearly 70% of New Mexicans who we know oppose trapping. They're supporting private commercial killing over ecosystem resilience in this really trying climate change that we're facing. They're propping up a dying and archaic industry over the emerging industry of outdoor recreation and tourism that's based on New Mexico's awesome public lands. And they're choosing cruelty over coexistence consistently. And I think this is just a few of the ways that they are doing wrong by New Mexico. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Jessica and let her kind of expand on the cruelty, which I think is a really, really important part of this conversation.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, so Chris has done a really good job of laying out some of the problems with trapping as far as climate change and ecosystem health. Mary Catherine, those heart-wrenching stories really bring to light the threat to public safety. That's a concern for not only those of us who live in New Mexico and like to go out on our public lands, but it's also particularly disturbing when we think about our state right now trying to take leaps into a greater outdoor recreation and tourism economy. What will happen when the first tourist or when the first child that we know of gets trapped in a trap on public lands? So there's all kinds of issues, but I think that the aspect of traps, snares, and even you know, sometimes I really consider the M44 cyanide bombs to be a type of trap, an indiscriminate killing device on our public lands. The aspect that really grabs most people right away is the cruelty. And I want to talk about this because right now, Chris just talked about our state game commission, and that body kind of oversees our state Department of Game and Fish, which formulates all of the rules for the Game Commission's approval, and does a lot of wildlife related work in our state. And those individuals have consistently set out that trapping is a fun sport, that it can be done ethically. They talk a lot about best practices. The department trucks have a signage on them that say, take your child hunting, fishing, and trapping. And so it's clearly lost on some people just how cruel this is. So just to, kind of describe, what do trapped animals go through? They experience not only physical pain, but psychological trauma. Even if a trapper is following regulations and checking their traps every 24 hours, or once every calendar day is really what the rule says, that's a lot of time for an animal to be out there and exposed to heat or cold, inclement weather. They can dehydrate, they can starve. They're stuck in one place. So if a predator species comes along, they can be attacked by that animal. As they're thrashing about, they can break or dislocate bones. As their injuries set in, they get infections. Some animals self-mutilate or self-amputate to try to escape the trap. And even when an animal is found alive by the trapper, the most common way of trappers, they call it dispatching or harvesting their trapped animal, is by bludgeoning them in the head, strangling or stomping them. And those are the traps that are supposed to leave the animals alive. There are some traps that are lethal. Conibear body crushing traps, neck snares, and M44s are designed to supposedly kill the animals relatively quickly. So if you're wondering, where does this happen in New Mexico? What exactly is happening out there? So over the past decade or so, the TrapFree New Mexico Coalition has been gathering stories and data to try to track where this is happening. And we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg, because probably still most New Mexicans, and certainly most tourists, don't know, they may not know about our coalition. They may not know that there's a website that you can go to in order to submit an incident report to talk about what happened. But we've collected well over 100 incidents over the past decade, a lot of them in recent years. So if you go to our website, trapfreenm.org, you can take a look at that trap. If there's an interactive, or you can take a look at that map. It's interactive, and you can click on each icon there and pull up a story, and sometimes even a photo of what happened. And so I just want to share some of those stories. And here's a warning, because these stories are going to come with some graphic photos. So totally understandable if that's just not what you can stomach on this beautiful Thursday night together. But I do want to share them, because if you're in your community, if you happen to talk with someone with the state or local government and they're wondering, are traps really that bad? I want to be able to arm you with some actual evidence to talk about. So here we go. If you are familiar with the legislation that our coalition has been pushing over the past several years, you may have heard of Roxy's Law. We started calling it Roxy's Law last year in honor of this dog. This was Sweet Roxy. Outside of Espanola, she was hiking with her person, got caught in a neck snare. This was on public land. And although actually that small section of public land did not allow snaring, I just want to point out that this method is perfectly legal in many other areas of the state. Her owner could not release her in time, and so she basically died in his arms. The trapper was found and cited for illegal trapping, but then the state agency mishandled the evidence, and the person that they found and initially brought charges against has now been let go off the hook. So Roxy's killer will never face justice. This is a picture of Mia Tuck, a young Mexican gray wolf. I'll just mention that this photo was actually him being sedated for GPS collaring. So he's actually okay in this photo. But unfortunately, his territory was in the Gila National Forest. He was purposefully trapped by a rancher who grazed in that area. When he was in the trap, he was bludgeoned with a shovel by the trapper. Apparently he was released, but then was later found dead with a shattered jaw and dislocated teeth. This beautiful gray fox was found in Placitas by a hiker on public land outside of Placitas. After taking this photo, she called some individuals, and there was a Good Samaritan that rescued the fox and treated her for her injuries and re-released her into the wild. And that person was actually punished by Game and Fish, and they tried to fine this person because it's illegal to tamper with the trapper's property, which includes the trap and the trapped animal under the law. This is one of the more recent stories. A cat was found in Rio Rancho with a lug hold trap attached to his leg. He was brought to a veterinarian for emergency medical treatment, but before that treatment could happen, the antibiotics didn't really kick in quickly enough, and the cat died from sepsis that had set in from the trap injury. This photo is of a trap, the aftermath of an out-of-state tourist, a tourist from Colorado who was riding her horse outside of Aztec and heard a raven sort of really screaming and causing a ruckus in the air, and she rode over to where the bird was and found that the raven's mate was caught in a leg hold trap. And the leg was pretty mutilated and bleeding, but she did figure out how to release the bird from the trap, and the raven did fly away. We don't know if the raven survived, but you can see, unfortunately, the blood that was left on that leg hold trap. This is one of the worst photos. This bobcat was found around the Magdalena area, washed up along a creek bed. You can see the leg hold trap is still attached to her foot. We just don't know what happened exactly to this bobcat. Maybe because it was along a creek bed, maybe it was a trap set close to water and the cat drowned. But clearly the trap was not properly staked because the bobcat was able to run away with the trap attached to her, and the trap may not have been checked as often as required by law. And this is Keikoa. He was a stray dog found in Valencia County with a leg hold trap attached to his foot with severe injuries. His leg was fractured. It looked like he had tried to chew off his own leg to escape the trap. He also had bite wounds covering his body. So we can imagine that maybe probably another animal had gone after him while he was caught in the trap. It took a lot of medical intervention to get him healthy again, over $3,000 in veterinary bills that a wonderful animal shelter took on, but he healed up. He is now a tripod because his leg was amputated, and he's been adopted. So there is a happy photo there. And so anyone that had to look away because of the gruesome photos, you can look again now, because that's the end of it. There's happy Kikoa. And then I also have another palette cleanser here. I know Joe Newman is watching this webinar. He's a wonderful, wonderful wildlife photographer who lives in El Dorado, and he takes the greatest coyote pictures. And these guys just look so happy, and that's how wildlife deserves to live. So with that, that having been said, I now want to talk about what can we do. As Chris mentioned, the Game Commission has just taken their best stab at it, and apparently they couldn't do much, or they wouldn't do much. So we're still expecting, even though some of the rule changes are now in effect, we are fully expecting there to still be the same risks to our dogs and other domestic companion animals when we go hike on public lands. We expect there to be a risk to hikers. We expect people to report finding wildlife languishing in traps. We don't see the rule changes solving the problem. So we are fully prepared to keep fighting for the legislation with our grassroots supporters like you along with us. So I know many of you have been involved, but for some of you, maybe this is your first time really delving into this issue, and you want to know how you can get involved in the legislative process to advocate for Roxy's Law. So just a quick review. The New Mexico legislature, I'm going to fly through this. We've got 112 legislators, 42 in the Senate, 70 in the House. Everyone who lives in New Mexico, you have one of each. You have one state senator and one state rep. And a bill has to pass through the Senate and the House and their committees in order to become law. The legislature meets every year, but depending on the year, they meet for either 30 days or 60 days. So in odd years, like 2021, that next year coming up, the next session, that's going to be what's called a long session. It's 60 days long. All bills are allowed to be considered during the long session. So that's when we will be pushing for Roxy's Law. Here's just a quick timeline of the past efforts to push this kind of legislation. And I won't read the slides, but I'll just mention that in the first couple of years, you know, this has been, despite the public support, this has been treated as a very controversial issue in the legislature, and really through the first 3 years, the bill was not able to pass a single committee before it died. But last year, in 2019, Roxy's Law did pass not only one, but 2 committees in the House. So that was some great progress. I think we're all really expecting there to just be more and more progress as we keep going with this fight. You can see the photo on the right. There's a picture of Mary Catherine and myself sitting at a table in a committee room testifying with one of our bill sponsors. Oh, and there's my email address in case any of you are feeling like, yes, I absolutely want to get involved. I can fill you in with all kinds of stuff that not only Animal Protection Voters does, but our allies do as well to support Roxy's Law. And New Mexico really does deserve this solution. You know, we're not actually reinventing the wheel or pushing the envelope in New Mexico. There are a lot of other states that have already placed restrictions on these horrible devices. You can see that Arizona banned traps, snares, and poisons on public lands decades ago. Colorado did it on all of their lands, public and private. You'll hear a lot that people will argue, well, we need to keep these, the trapped animals, the populations in check to protect our livestock. But you can see the charts on the right side of the screen show that there's actually livestock are less safe in New Mexico than in Arizona and Colorado, where traps are restricted. And then, of course, New Mexico voters really, they want to see traps off of our public lands. Most people don't support traps, period. This was a poll in 2015 that was conducted, and almost 70% of New Mexico voters oppose traps and snares, period. So here's some things that you can do right now. So even though we're all sheltering in place and working from home, democracy is not canceled. There is still a primary election coming up. There's a general election coming up in November. Here in New Mexico, we are busy electing our next state legislators. So find out who your legislators are, talk to them about this issue, talk to the candidates running against those legislators, or talking to the candidates running for any open seats if you live in that district. And really share with them how this is a top issue for you, and your support hinges on their position on this issue. It's that important. So you can find out who your legislators are at nmlegis.gov, and all of the candidates running for elections can be found at the New Mexico Secretary of State's website. The URL is there. There's also a lot, with the public health crisis, people are wondering, well, how am I going to be able to vote? I don't really want to go in person to a polling place. You don't have to. Right now, if you are a registered voter, you can go to nmvote.org and request a absentee ballot. And then you'll get it sent in the mail, you fill it out, you mail it back. Easy peasy. So definitely encourage you to do that. And then, of course, we don't try to do a lot of routine fundraising, but we do have plans for how we would like to get out the word with this TrapFree campaign. So if you can donate, if you can help spread the word by sharing an online petition, then please do so. You can go to trapfreenm.org to find information on how to do that. Thank you so much for taking time with us tonight. And I think I'll hand it over back to Chris to help facilitate some Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thanks, Jessica. And thank you all for hanging with us so far. Just before we start the Q&A, there have actually been some great questions asked, and I want to get to those. But before I do that, I want to share these helpful links. I know that Jessica shared several of them, but this way you can actually copy and paste them into your web browsers if you'd like. So I've just shared in the chat our online petition, which you can both fill out if you haven't already and share with your friends and family and neighbors. There's our link to donate. There's a link to the trapping incidents map. And then we'd love to hear your feedback on this webinar. So there's a link to an anonymous survey there too. And with that said, I'd love to get into some questions. I'm gonna go back a little bit in the chat, but keep the questions coming, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So a question from Catherine is, how do trappers still have so much influence over the commission when they are such a small number? Either Jessica or Mary Catherine, would you like to take that on?
We haven't heard from Mary Catherine in a while, so.
And I'm still here, so. Yeah, it's astonishing how much influence they have. And I think it's just, there's no position on the Game Commission that's reserved for someone who does not hunt or fish or trap, for someone who's only involved in conservation. So I think the mindset is just, I hate the word harvest, but I think that's what it is. It's using wildlife for human consumption. And it's that's certainly another effort that's coming down the pike to try to change that as well. And we've just seen this incredible alliance between ranchers, between trappers, between hunters, and between the Game Commission. It's just like this cabal that certainly could stand reform too.
Thanks. Here's another question from Catherine that I think is a good one. It's, do trappers make a living in New Mexico? And I've been kind of gathering some data and crunching some numbers recently. And I think that the simplest and shortest answer is no, they don't. There's definitely nuance in there. There are perhaps a handful of trappers who make more money than others, of course, but there are roughly, depending on the year, between 1,800 and 2,000 in-state trappers in New Mexico. And on average, those trappers gross somewhere between $250 and $400 a year. And that is gross, so that does not take into account the money they're spending on traps, on bait, on gas to go check their trap lines, on any other incidental expenses. So I suspect the net is probably closer to zero or even in the negative for most trappers. So no, there are not significant numbers of trappers making a living from trapping in New Mexico. Any additions to that, Jessica or Mary Catherine?
I'll just add that, that what Chris just shared is really good information. And to Catherine's previous question, the other thing that has been influential in the roundhouse in the New Mexico State Legislature is some trappers kind of telling a sob story about how, this is how they are able to put food on the table. And so I think it's really important that that we are working on ways to refute that with actual data. That for the most part, the vast majority of trappers, they do this as a hobby, or they do this because they're involved in the animal agriculture industry. So it's more about just destroying the animals rather than selling the fur.
And I would add that these animals don't bring a lot of money when it comes to each individual pelt. A swift fox pelt, a swift fox has been nominated to be on the endangered species list, and political reasons have kept it off. But a swift fox pelt goes for about $10. A ringtail for about $12. A gray fox, maybe $20. A coyote, maybe $50. Bobcats are the most lucrative, but with our global financial shutdown, I can well imagine that bobcats will barely bring a couple of $100s in the coming season. So you would have to catch a lot of coyotes to make a living at it.
Quick question from Roland, or not a quick question, but one that has a quick answer to it. Are the number of trapping licenses limited? And if so, would there be a benefit for non-trappers to buy a license? No, they're unlimited, Roland, here in New Mexico. So it actually hurts our cause if non-trappers buy trapping licenses, because then it looks like more people are trapping. Question from Pamela, is there any enforcement of trap check times? I honestly believe there is zero or close to it. I certainly want to let Mary Catherine and Jessica take longer cracks at this, but I can tell you that in New Mexico, there is a game warden for approximately every 2,000 square miles. May have that number slightly off, but suffice it to say, there are not nearly enough game wardens or wildlife officers out there to provide any substantive check on trappers. Do either of you want to chime in on that?
Sure, yeah.
I would agree.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you think about how few game wardens there are for such a large area, we've also heard directly from Game and Fish that they are not out there actively patrolling, looking for violations. They only simply respond to reports from other people.
Yeah, and not to belabor this too much, but we also know that a good chunk of New Mexico's game wardens are trappers themselves. And they purport that that helps them better monitor trap lines because they kind of know the people who are doing them, they know where it's happening, they know how it's happening. But I think there's also potential for a conflict of interest there in terms of law enforcement. Here's a question from Marilyn. Does anyone know how much agriculture pays trappers to trap for them? That is a good question, Marilyn, and I don't have a good answer, but maybe Mary Catherine or Jessica, you do?
I'm only thinking about Wildlife Services, which is a government agency that traps for agricultural interests for free. The taxpayers pay for that. Other than that, I don't know that any ranchers actually pay people to trap. They usually let them keep the pelts they trap.
That's my understanding too, that for the most part, that's what it is. The landowner gives permission or solicits trappers to come trap animals, and then they're able to take whatever monetary value from the animals that they can get.
And I would add, just before we go on, that there are plenty of livestock owners and operators who do not routinely kill wildlife by trapping. So it's not a universal. I mean, at the hearings, it sounds like that every rancher needs their coyotes to be killed, and removed. But there are plenty of ranchers who don't routinely do that. They usually don't come to hearings, unfortunately.
Hey, thanks for the platform, Mary Catherine. Wild Earth Guardians is hosting a Coexisting with Carnivores webinar on this coming Monday. And you can learn all about how ranchers and farmers deal with animals in non-lethal manners there. You can find out about that on our website. Questions keep coming in. Patty, this is another good question that requires a short answer. I assume there's some legal reason a trap ban must be done legislatively, i.e. not a ballot issue. So, a trap ban could be carried out by the Game Commission, but they so far refuse to entertain that seriously. We do not have ballot measures here in New Mexico, and it would require a constitutional change to enact that. So that's why we rely on legislation to pass our trapping ban. And then here's another question. What can people from other states do to help you? Trapping is now banned in my home state of California. Mary Catherine or Jessica?
I'll take a stab at that as Mary Catherine. If you know people in New Mexico and want to share the TrapFree New Mexico petition with them just as broadly as you can, that would be wonderful. And I'll go back to the donation page. We certainly, there are costs associated with trying to run a bill through the legislature, hiring a lobbyist to help us, to keep track of legislators, to make sure we can get the message through to them. So that would be incredibly helpful. If you want to make a donation, we certainly could use it.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And, sharing our petition, if you know of any maybe somewhat influential people in your state who maybe could contact our legislators here, contact our Game and Fish Department, contact our governor's office, let them know that you would love to come visit New Mexico, but you're a little concerned about your own safety, the safety of any companion animals you bring with you. You're concerned about the destruction of our ecology and the wildlife and what you might see if you're out on our public lands. I think there's some leverage that some people from out of state could have in that respect.
Couple other questions that have come in, and there's also a hand raised. So first I'm going to get to this question because it's been sitting there for a couple minutes. What do trappers say about the cruelty of their so-called sport? Have you ever spoken to some? Again, I'll let Mary Catherine and Jessica take a first crack. I do have some thoughts, but go ahead.
I'm waiting to hear yours, Chris, because at the forum created by New Mexico Game and Fish, I know you sat at a table with trappers. I also did too, and I think they're just so inured to it, they don't see it. They think they're doing a public service by culling these animals, by removing them from nature. It's a hard thing to wrap my head around, and especially a lot of them have dogs. I've talked to trappers who love their dogs, and yet have no trouble doing this horrible, creating this horrible treatment for coyotes, which are also dogs, but they just happen to be wild dogs. It's hard for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that I have spoken to a number of trappers. I've had some pretty long dialogues with them, and the most common theme I would say that I find amongst trappers is a perspective that wildlife is there to be used as a resource, and I would switch out the word abuse in most cases. So there's not necessarily a natural reverence for wildlife or an understanding of the importance that wildlife plays in our planet. And that's how I've seen that question approached. I've also heard trappers say that, you know, when trapping is done right, a leg hold trap on an animal, that animal will just eventually go to sleep, and then the trapper will kill them very nicely when they show up. Or, you know, kill traps are always going to instantly kill the animal and there's no suffering. And we know that not to be true, but those are common refrains that I've heard from trappers.
Yeah, I think in addition to the lack of reverence for a lot of wildlife, for some species, especially coyotes, there's actually hatred. It seems like the motivation to trap them and try to decimate their populations really comes from a place of anger. You know, that's just talking with some of the trappers that I've spoken to, and I think a lot of them, you know, that there's not a large number of trappers in our state, but the ones that are here, a lot of them grew up with it. You know, they started trapping as a kid with their grandpa or their dad or their uncle. And so I think they've just become kind of numb to it, because I've also had the privilege of meeting a couple of people who used to trap, but have given it up and sworn it off, and now say to themselves, I can't believe I didn't see just what I was doing and just how awful it was. And I think it's very hard for people to get to that place of reckoning, and I give those people a lot of credit.
So to those of you who have raised your hands, I'm actually having some technical difficulties allowing you to speak. So if you are able to chat your question into the box, that would be great. And if for some reason you can't do that, please feel free to email us and we'll try to answer questions. I'm sorry about that problem. I thought it would be a possibility. Here's a question from Patricia. How do we get the 7 out of New Mexico Game and Fish and put people in charge that represent the 70%? Are they appointed by the governor, and how long is their tenure? Michelle Lou Hungersham is progressive in many ways. Does she have any effect on the agency? Mary Catherine or Jessica?
Yeah, so the 7 game commissioners, they are appointed by the governor and they serve at the pleasure of the governor. So she appoints them. She is also able to remove them for any cause. When they're appointed, they are supposed to undergo a confirmation process by our state Senate. It would first go through the Senate Rules Committee and then go to the full Senate, and the legislators there have to vote to support the nomination or the appointment of that person to the commission. But there has been a problem with several boards and commissions, but definitely the Game Commission, where the commissioners never they either never go through that confirmation process, or they go through it several years after they've been appointed. And so so they've just been serving without confirmation for that amount of time. You know, certainly while we are pushing for Roxy's Law in the legislature, we would also gladly welcome the Game Commission in whatever formation they might be in, to simply take action through regulations to ban traps and snares and poisons on public lands.
I'll quickly chime in that Wild Earth Guardians has a YouTube channel, and we recently had a webinar with Kevin Bixby of the Southwest Environmental Center talking about the North American model, which talks about some broader Game Commission issues. And then we also have a webinar up there on wildlife conservation funding, which gets into Game Commission issues. So I would welcome people to check those out. And if you can't find them, send me an email and I will send them to you. Any thoughts on this question, Mary Catherine, or should we move on?
You covered it, and covered it well. Thank you.
Okay, there's just a couple here, and we're getting short on time. So here's a question: is the practice fading out in the younger populations, i.e., there's not a new generation of trappers? Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
The latest numbers that I've seen is that for the most part, at least over the past 5 years or so, the number of trapping licenses being purchased has stayed relatively steady, which was surprising to me. But I think that that's a testament to, I think what often happens is people grow up with it. You know, they know someone who does it, and so they go out with them and you know, check the trap line together. So there still seems to be a steady number of trappers. Most of them are men in their 30s and 40s.
Yeah, and
I would add,
go ahead, Mary Catherine.
It's still a really small number. I would just add, it's still a really small number. I mean, typically 2,000 licenses are sold, and not all of those are for trapping. I mean, the same license is used for shooting a fox or a bobcat if a hunter should see one. So it is a very tiny number. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, there's a broader trend in the United States, nearly everywhere, of hunting numbers declining. And the reaction to that by state wildlife agencies and by sportsman groups is to try to recruit new hunters, including young hunters. And as Jessica alluded to, there's bumper stickers on the traps of game and fish trucks that say, "Take a child trapping." So my guess in answering the question is that young trappers are declining, and that reaction by game and fish is to that trend, but I can't be sure. Okay, I think we've gone through and answered most of the questions. I apologize if I've missed a couple. I know there were some earlier that we may have not gotten to, but I would strongly encourage you to send those to us and we will answer them as best we can. And I would also like to thank everyone for joining and sticking with us. I'd remind you to get involved in the capacity you're able, and we are going to win this eventually. And I'd also like to thank Jessica and Mary Catherine for joining me. Any final thoughts, you two?
This is Mary Catherine. I thank everyone, and it's going to take all of us because trapping is so entrenched. So thank you for spending a little more than an hour this evening with us and learning more about the issue. And onward we go. Thank you.
Yeah, similarly, I just want to say thank you. It's so meaningful that all of you have decided to spend your evenings with us to really dig in deep on this issue. We are in it for the long haul. You know, this issue feels a lot like the effort to ban cockfighting in New Mexico, which took 17 years. And my goodness, we are not trying to stretch this into 17 years. This trapping should have been ended yesterday. But I just want to say that because you know, we're fighting against, like Mary Catherine said, something deeply entrenched, something that feels to a small number of people, a small but vocal number of people, that this is their culture, and it's really, really hard to change that. So thank you for linking arms with us and being willing to take on this fight. I look forward to seeing all of you again really soon.
Yeah, thank you all, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Stay healthy.